Well, ladies and gentlemen, it's D-Day. You know, D-Day, that's apparently the last day that negotiations could have potentially occurred before the tariffs. And that was, well, yesterday. So today is the day of the tariffs coming in, unless South Africa manages to get an agreement. But they haven't. So before we get onto the main video of today, can I yet again remind you, if you haven't already, subscribe to the channel, hit the bell icon, and join the channel. Anyway, let's get on to the news of today. Let's talk about the tariffs, because to be frank, what else is there to talk about? So as you will know, that one of the sticking points, supposedly, that the US and South Africa haven't been able to come to terms on yet, is actually against the rigid black economic empowerment policies being adopted by South Africa. Now, Washington is reportedly frustrated that BEE remains a non-negotiable, despite its negative impact on trade and competitiveness. Now, South Africa did say that what they would do instead is that they would offer 60 billion rand in private investment incentives, but refused to amend BEE criteria. And to that, the Americans said, do one. Now, some analysts have warned that this could result in exclusions from future trade deals, including the AGOA renewal. Now, major investors are alarmed for obvious reasons, and they are citing regulatory unpredictability and ideological inflexibility as being factors now that mean South Africa isn't really an investment destination. They see all of this as really telling because in other news, the Trade Minister Parks says that South Africa must submit a revised last-minute offer to the US in order to avoid the implementation of the 30% tariffs. Now, according to him, the tariffs could, as you know, threaten up to 100,000 jobs, which include agriculture and the automotive sectors. But according to him, diplomatic heavyweights such as Ronald Ramola have also been engaging with Washington, D.C. in order to alleviate concerns. Now, according to the current news from them, it's amazing that the BEE policies, yes, were one of the main issues highlighted, but apparently now the legal case against Israel has also been cited as one of the key issues affecting a deal. Not really sure how that happened, but in any case, the South African delegations include government, business, civil society, and labor groups, and will all be mobilized in order to sway US decision makers. But you see, I find the inclusion of the case against Israel to be almost like a last-minute overthought, and I think that they're going to use this as saying, see, it's not just our inflexibility on BEE, it's also our case against the ICJ. And in other words, I think they're starting to make excuses. Now, in response, the current news is that the authorities are now having to explore potential tax incentives or some kind of intervention packages for the industries affected by these tariffs in order that the industries themselves don't immediately collapse when these tariffs come in. So it seems to me that they know full well they're not going to get an agreement because they're already making the excuses and putting in place the mitigation mechanisms that are going to have to be put in place in order to tide them over till they think they can get an agreement. Now, whether or not that actual agreement is forthcoming, don't really know. But what we do know is that the actual critical window to avert disaster is closing, and economic recovery ambitions are going to fade completely with these tariffs. Now, everybody is expecting this to occur, which is why the rand at time of recording plunged to 18 rand a dollar, which is marking a 1-month low amid the uncertainty with the actual impending tariffs. But you see, some analysts, such as Davi Roots, are suggesting that actually the tariff threat itself isn't actually the real disaster. The real disaster is going to come from the multiple sectors that provide services to the key areas affected by the tariffs. So in other words, if farmers themselves are affected because of agriculture, well, that could have a knock-on effect on suppliers of goods to farms, whether it be the wholesalers that provide, fertilizer or seeds, or maybe even the supply of farming equipment like tractors, for example. So he's saying that the actual fallout of this is likely to be huge. And one of the key issues that are going to be caused by these entire tariffs and the knock-on effects of them is that South Africa as a destination is going to be sidelined. It's going to lose trade access and investor confidence and will no longer be seen by its global peers as being a form of global competitiveness. It's not going to have that global competitiveness. So when people actually think about South Africa, they're not going to go, oh, that's a dynamic place, let's go invest there. And this is going to lead to prolonged stagnation, which is going to affect South Africa's capital inflows and forms of our credibility as an investment destination. And that's going to cause a long-term contraction. So what does that actually mean in basic language? Well, what that means is that the effects are going to be felt for a number of years after these tariffs have been implemented. And the actual knock-on effect is going to be, well, jobs and investment. No one's going to want to do business here because South Africa is not going to be considered open for business. It's effectively going to be considered closed for business. So moving then on to some positive stories. And this was the first news story about Geopolitical, who challenged the Property Practitioners Regulatory Authority Board over its ruling, which required estate agents to hold a minimum of a 40-point BE score to qualify for Fidelity Fund certificates, essentially licenses to operate. Now, you will know that Geopolitical said that this was racist, and they actually issued a court case against it. Well, as of now, as of yesterday, the Minister of Trade, Industry and Competition, Minister Park, has formally withdrawn his opposition to Geopolitical's case, signaling official backing for the legal challenge. In other words, the government themselves don't actually believe that this should be done, and so now Geopolitical is going to challenge the property regulators unopposed. Now, the PPRA has, as a result, quietly dropped the enforcement of the BE certificate submissions for the Fidelity Fund certificates and appears to be reversing the policy introduced in 2024 that would have denied operators licenses for non-compliance. Now, Geopolitical and property regulators have hailed the decision as a win for business survival and regulatory accountability, but it does show you that there is a high degree of brazenness when it comes through to regulators to try to put people out of business unless they comply with these arbitrary, stupid rules that they seem to come out with all the time. And thank goodness that there are companies such as Geopolitical who is fighting against this. Talking of some really weird stuff, and as I said, we've already started to see the whole, oh, look, there's an ICJ case against Israel. That's why we're not getting a trade deal with the US. We've already started seeing that being troped out now as a potential excuse. Well, as of yesterday, Cyril Ramaphosa stated that it was no longer palatable to ignore what he called the genocide claims in Gaza, and he states that South Africa has a moral responsibility to act on the global stage. Now, the ANC continues to push for sanctions against Israel and prosecution of its leaders at the ICC, and Ramaphosa's speech, which was delivered, seemed to suggest a foreign policy tilt towards Iran and Hamas, which, as you'll know, will isolate South Africa's traditional Western allies and further sour relations between the US and the EU. And this has led many individuals to ask the question of why. South Africa has no meaningful trade with Iran. In fact, the trade is almost non-existent. And yet, they seem to be very wedded to Iranian obligations for reasons. I don't know. Now, we've also seen this play out in what I can only describe as the world's largest double standards. And this is the news that Taiwan has had their office in South Africa being downgraded, and they've had the diplomatic status downgraded in favor of China. But according to the South African government, they will no longer consider the Taiwanese office to have any form of credibility, and that the People's Republic of China are the only one who can now, according to them, speak for that territory. Now, in retaliation, Taiwan said they would consider curbs on high-tech semiconductors exported to South Africa. They effectively said that Pretoria's position violates the long-standing, albeit informal, diplomatic balance maintained with Taiwan and South Africa. Now, the Taiwanese officials are reportedly angered and have warned that this could impact South Africa's access to telecommunications, defense, and in many instances, automobiles. As you know, South Africa's automobile industry relies on semiconductors. Semiconductors are everywhere, even in the seat going backwards and forwards. There's a semiconductor. And if they restrict South Africa's access to semiconductors, well, that means the manufacturing of any of these goods is pretty much going to be off the table. So, yet again, we're seeing another move, which is effectively isolating, yet again, more Western allies. And one has to ask the question here as to why Gaza is, according to Ramaphosa, allowed the right to have some forms of self-governance underneath a Palestinian banner, but Taiwan isn't. It's almost like the Palestinians are allowed a state, but the Taiwanese aren't. The Ukrainians aren't allowed a state, but Russia is. It's very strange. It's almost like there is a very partisan position going on here. And that's obviously against what Ramaphosa suggests that they're doing, and that's a non-partisan. But if you look at it from a purely logical perspective, and you just use rationality, if your view is that a party is entitled to be self-governing, they're entitled to their own state, they want it, then you have to apply that to anybody that wants to be self-governing and have their own state, which means Ukraine, Gaza, and Taiwan. So these approaches then would seem highly antagonistic and to a degree rather hypocritical. Now, moving on to a final news story, and talking of proper hypocritical, Iran. Let's cover this. Iran suggests that it wants the United States to agree to compensate it for the damage which occurred during the 12-day conflict. So according to them, they criticized the US and Israeli strikes for disrupting negotiations in relation to the nuclear talks and demanded assurances that the attacks won't ever occur in the future, which I think would be very difficult because they don't know what Iran would actually do in the future. If Iran did some really dodgy stuff, yeah, they'll probably bomb you again because that's the nature of antagonism. But in any case, they said that in order to progress any form of diplomacy between the two countries, a good, real confidence-building step would include reparations and security guarantees. Yeah, I'm not sure that that's how this works. So according to Iran, they reaffirmed their rights to uranium enrichment, but they rejected a deal that demands that they halt enrichment completely. So it's like, don't worry, we're going to enrich ourselves for uranium for the purposes of a power station, but we'd never create a weapon. Honest, Scout's honor. Except they probably would, because they said they would numerous times. Now, the actual idea that the US needs to compensate them is just like bizarre. I don't know why you would do that. I mean, that's what happens in warfare. You go to war, you bomb some stuff, and it's the nature of war. Very peculiar. Do let me know what you think in the comment section below. As per usual, these are just my views. Do let me know what you think. Until tomorrow, bye.